My name is Lucas Brown, and I grew up in a small, isolated farming community in America. From a young age, my life was always shaped by simplicity. We had no electricity, cars, or any kind of modern technology. Our way of life was defined by a strict adherence to traditions and rules that had been passed down from generation to generation. Every aspect of our existence, from the way we dressed to how we practiced our faith, was regulated. I believed that obedience to these traditions was the right path to achieving salvation. Living under these norms seemed natural to me because it was all I knew. However, even while faithfully following all the rules, something inside me questioned if it was enough to please God. During religious services and silent prayer moments, I felt an emptiness that disturbed me. Questions arose in my mind, but I repressed them, as we were taught that questioning was dangerous and that trust in the community's traditions was the only way. My life took an unexpected turn on a cold winter morning. I was returning home with my cart after a quick trip to town when an out-of-control truck came around a curve and hit me head-on. I didn't even have time to scream before everything went dark. In that instant, my world disappeared, and I plunged into complete emptiness. What I didn't know was that my true journey was just beginning. When the truck hit my cart, time seemed to stop. There was a deafening crash followed by absolute silence. I waited for the pain but felt nothing. When I opened my eyes, I realized I was no longer in my cart or on the road. I was in a completely different place, a place of oppressive darkness that enveloped me from all sides. The air was heavy, and a cold fear crept into my soul. I tried to move, but it seemed the ground was not solid. There was no sense of direction, no point of reference, just an infinite void. I called for help, but my voice was swallowed by the silence. Confusion soon gave way to fear. Where was I? Was this death? I always believed that those who led a good and obedient life would go to heaven. Hadn't I followed all the rules? So why wasn't I in God's presence? As I tried to understand what was happening, scenes from my life began to unfold before me. They were not ordinary memories but distant images that I observed as a spectator. I saw myself working in the fields, participating in religious services, and helping my family. Superficially, everything seemed good and faithful. However, these scenes began to change, revealing moments that I had hidden deep within myself. Moments of doubt and fear, times when I questioned whether the rules were enough. These moments of doubt showed me how my rigid obedience had turned me into someone proud and judgmental. I realized that by following the rules so perfectly, I had become critical of those who struggled with the same doubts as I did. I looked at them with disdain, believing myself superior because of my adherence to the traditions. But now, seeing my life through this new perspective, I realized that my faith had been superficial, focused on appearances and rules, not on a true relationship with God. In that oppressive void, I felt more alone than I had ever felt. The scenes continued to pass before me, revealing not only moments of doubt but also the consequences of my actions. I saw how my pride in blindly following the rules had turned me into someone critical and distant. The people I loved and who struggled with their own doubts, I had pushed away with my harsh judgment. Those who needed support, I had ignored, convinced that my own obedience was sufficient proof of my righteousness. As these scenes unfolded, a deep sense of regret began to take hold of me. I saw how my actions, though well-intentioned, caused pain. My focus on following the rules had prevented me from truly loving and understanding others. I felt an overwhelming weight of guilt, as if the darkness around me was feeding on this regret. It was as if I were being consumed by the void I so feared. For the first time in my life, I recognized that I had depended more on my efforts and my own righteousness than on a true relationship with God. Suddenly, a point of light appeared in the distance. Small and weak at first, but it began to grow, bringing with it a sense of hope that I hadn't felt in a long time. The darkness around seemed to retreat in the face of the growing light. The closer the light got, the more I felt a warm and welcoming presence. The fear and guilt that had consumed me began to fade away, replaced by a sense of peace I had never known. And then, finally, I saw. Jesus stood before me, radiant and full of such pure love that tears began to roll down my face. His presence was overwhelming, but in a way that made me feel completely known and loved. He looked directly into my eyes, and I felt that he could see every corner of my soul, the good and the bad, the doubts and the pride. But in his gaze, there was no condemnation, only compassion. He called me by name, Lucas, and asked why I had trusted so much in the works of my hands and the traditions of men, rather than in his grace. I tried to speak, to justify my actions, but the words did not come. Deep down, I knew he was right. I had spent my entire life trying to follow rules, believing they would save me, but I never understood the true meaning of knowing him. I whispered an apology, tears streaming down my face. "I didn't know," I said. "I thought I was doing what you wanted." Jesus knelt beside me, placing his hand on my shoulder. "Lucas," he said, his voice firm and gentle, "I have been with you all along, waiting for you to turn to me. The rules cannot save you, but my love can. My grace is sufficient." In that moment, the light around him seemed to shine even more brightly, and I felt a healing warmth envelop me. I then realized that it wasn't about how well I followed the rules or how hard I worked, but about accepting his love and grace, a gift given freely and undeservedly. On my knees in his presence, I knew my life was about to change forever. The darkness was gone, and for the first time, I felt free. Jesus reached out his hand to me, and as I held it, I felt a peace that I knew would never leave me. The journey was not over, but I was no longer afraid. I had found the truth, and it had set me free. Standing in the radiant light of Jesus, the overwhelming love and peace filling every part of me, I felt unworthy to be in his presence, but his gaze assured me that I belonged there, not because of anything I had done, but because of who he was. As I stood there, enveloped by the radiant light and presence of Jesus, I felt a peace I had never known before. He looked at me with so much love and understanding that my words failed me. I knew, in that moment, that the life I had led until then, based on rules and traditions, was not the true purpose of faith. Jesus placed his hand on my shoulder and said, "Lucas, you have lived sincerely, seeking to honor God, but you have carried a burden that I never wanted you to carry." His words pierced my heart. I wanted to object, to say that I had done my best, that I had followed the community's rules with the greatest fidelity possible, but deep down, I knew he was right. I had lived with a constant sense of stress, always afraid of not being good enough, always wondering if I had done enough to please God. "Come with me," Jesus said, gesturing toward the light that surrounded us. Suddenly, scenes of my life began to unfold. It was as if I were outside of time, watching my own story play out before me. At first, I saw the good moments of hard work, devotion, and faithfulness. I saw the countless hours working in the fields, the prayers said in the silence of the night, the sacrifices made to lead a simple life. But then the scenes changed. I saw moments when my devotion turned into pride, where my obedience to the rules made me look down on others. I saw the times when I judged my brothers and sisters in the community, believing their struggles were a sign of weakness, while my adherence to the rules made me righteous. I was so focused on doing what was right that I forgot the true reason why we lived simply in the first place, to get closer to God. Tears streamed down my face as I watched the effects of my actions. I saw how my pride hurt other people, how my judgment pushed people away from me and, worse, from God. Moments that I had dismissed as insignificant now showed their full weight, a careless word here, a refusal to show grace there, all adding up, leaving wounds I didn't even know I had caused. "You believed the rules were enough," Jesus said gently, "but the rules were never meant to save you. They were meant to point you to me." I fell to my knees, overwhelmed by regret. "I thought I was doing the right thing," I whispered. "I thought if I followed the rules, I would be pleasing God." Jesus knelt beside me, his presence overwhelming but comforting. "Lucas, you cannot earn what has already been given. My grace is a gift, not a reward. You followed the rules, but you never allowed yourself to know me fully, and knowing me is what truly matters." As he spoke, another scene began to unfold, this time not about my past, but about what could be. I saw myself living with a freedom I had never known. Still working hard, still living simply, but there was a joy and a peace that hadn't existed before. Instead of striving to earn God's love, I was living from the place of already being loved. I saw myself sharing this new truth with others, not in judgment, but in love, helping them see that grace was the foundation of true faith. "These are the plans I have for you," Jesus said, his voice full of hope. "Plans to prosper you, to give you a future and a hope, but you must choose to walk in them." Looking at Jesus, my heart was heavy with the realization of how much time I had wasted trying to earn something I already had. I asked in a trembling voice, "How can I walk in this freedom if I have spent my whole life trying to deserve it?" Jesus smiled, the kind of smile that made all fear disappear. "By trusting in me," he replied simply. "Let go of the burden you carry, let go of the fear of not being enough. My grace is sufficient for you, Lucas. My power is made perfect in weakness." The light around us grew brighter, and for the first time, I felt the chains I had carried for so long begin to fall away. They were not physical chains, but chains of fear, pride, and striving that had imprisoned my soul. I felt lighter, freer than I could have ever imagined. "There is no condemnation for those who are in me," Jesus said, his voice resonating with authority. "Your sins have been forgiven, your mistakes washed away. You are not defined by the rules you followed or the mistakes you made. You are defined by my love for you." I wept as his words washed over me, filling me with a peace I knew would never leave me. I then realized that my life was not about ticking boxes or following rules. It was about knowing him, walking with him, and sharing his love with others. "You have received much, Lucas," Jesus said, standing up and extending his hand to me. "Now go and share what you have seen. Help others see the truth, not the burden of religion, but the freedom of grace." I took his hand, and as I stood, I felt a strength I had never known. The light around us seemed to pulse with life, and I knew that moment had changed everything. The rules that once seemed like a prison were no longer chains, but simply tools I could now use to point others to the God who saved me. "Go, Lucas," Jesus said, his voice full of love and authority. "And remember, I am always with you." The vision began to fade, but the peace and purpose I felt remained. I knew I was being sent back to the world I had left, but I was no longer afraid. I had found the truth, and my life would never be the same. When I woke up, I found myself lying by the side of the road, surrounded by paramedics. The pain in my body was intense, but it did not compare to the peace that filled my soul. In the days that followed, I began to recover from the accident, both physically and emotionally. At first, I didn't know how to explain what I had experienced. Who would believe me? But the more I prayed, the clearer the urgency in my heart became. I could not remain silent. Jesus had not shown me these things just for my benefit. I had been given a mission, and I could not run from it. When my family came to visit me in the hospital, my father, a man of few words, placed his hand on my shoulder and said, "God spared you, Lucas. He must have a purpose for your life." Little did he know how true those words were. I wanted to tell them about my experience, but the words seemed difficult to find. I needed time to process everything and seek wisdom on how to share what I had learned. I kept the details to myself for a while, as I prayed and reflected on the best way to tell my story. Finally, during a family dinner, I felt it was the right time to open my heart. I told them everything: the darkness, the encounter with Jesus, the revelation that grace, not rules, was the key to a true relationship with God. My mother started to cry, and my younger siblings listened with wide eyes. My father, however, remained impassive. "Lucas," he said calmly, "what you are saying goes against everything we have learned. The rules are the foundation of our faith. Without them, there is only chaos." I responded, trying to stay calm. "Father, I'm not saying the rules are bad, but they are not what saves us. Jesus showed me that it is His grace, not our works, that gives us freedom and life. The rules should point us to Him, not replace Him." My father's expression hardened. Be careful, Lucas. Questioning what we have been taught is dangerous. It can lead you away from the community, away from everything we believe in. His words came from a place of fear, not malice. He had lived his entire life believing that following the rules was the only way to please God. But I knew I couldn't let this fear silence me. In the following months, I began to share my testimony with others in the community. At first, people were curious but cautious. They were intrigued by my story but hesitant to fully embrace the message of grace over works. Some listened with tears in their eyes, confessing that they too felt overwhelmed trying to follow the rules without ever feeling God's love. Others were more resistant, accusing me of abandoning the teachings that had guided our people for generations. The opposition grew as my story spread. Some community leaders warned others not to listen to me, labeling me as an agitator who threatened the unity of our way of life. I was even called before a council of church leaders, where they questioned my intentions. Lucas, an elder said with sadness in his voice, "You have always been a faithful member of this community. Why are you sowing division with these ideas?" I responded, "I'm not trying to divide anyone. I'm trying to point people to Jesus. He showed me that it's not about the rules, but about knowing Him and living in His grace. This is the message I have been called to share." Their faces showed a mixture of skepticism and sadness, and I left the meeting knowing I was walking a lonely path. But even in the face of rejection, I felt a deep peace. I was not alone. Jesus was with me, as He had promised. Despite the resistance, I began to see the seeds of change taking root. One time, a young man named Gabriel approached me after a service. He had always been quiet and reserved, but now his eyes showed a mix of despair and hope. "Lucas," he said with a trembling voice, "I felt the same doubts you described. I have followed the community's rules my entire life, but I have never felt close to God. I want to know Him as you do. Can you help me?" Hearing these words filled my heart with joy. We began to meet in secret, praying together and studying the Bible. Over time, Gabriel's faith grew stronger, and he began to experience the freedom and peace that come from a true relationship with Jesus. His transformation inspired others, and soon small groups of believers began to form, seeking a deeper connection with God beyond the rules. It was not easy. The opposition did not disappear, and there were moments when I felt crushed by loneliness and doubt. But whenever I prayed, I felt the presence of Jesus reminding me of His promise, "My grace is sufficient for you." Now, looking back on those first months, I see how God was at work, even in the most difficult moments. The seeds of grace and truth began to spread, and while the journey is far from over, I know I am walking the path He has laid out for me. I am no longer defined by fear or striving. I am a transformed man, living in the freedom of His love, and I will continue to share this message with everyone who will listen. One day, while working in the fields, I found myself reflecting on the beauty of the journey God had set before me. The peace I now felt in my heart contrasted with the constant anxiety of before. My new mission was clear: to live and share the truth of God's grace. This mission was not easy and required courage to face resistance. But each rejection was a reminder that true freedom lay in following Jesus, not human rules. Encounters with people like Gabriel gave me strength. They showed that the message of grace had the power to change lives, just as it had changed mine. The transformation I saw in others was a living testimony of God's love and His ability to reach even the hardest hearts. That's why I will continue to walk this path, trusting that every step is being guided by Him. With each new day, I wake up with a renewed purpose. I am no longer a slave to fear or striving. I live in the freedom that only the love of Jesus can provide. The journey may be full of challenges, but each transformed life makes it all worth it. And I know that as long as I continue to share the truth of God's grace, I will be fulfilling the mission He has given me.